You really have to go? Sue asked Rob. Yes, I don't want to, though, he said back. I'm supposed to be able to buy tickets on a website. It's not Excite. What did she say it was? Expedia? Yeah, that's it. Get the computer, I'll do the ordering for you. He was relieved. Thank you. They got the laptop and picked the best round-trip deal they could find. Sue asked how long he was going to be away. He suggested a week. He would try to come back sooner if he could. He had no idea what he was really in for. Sue reminded him that he was scheduled to feed again in a week. He said that he had thought of that, and maybe it was good to do one across state lines to break things up. She didn't have a response for that. She was clearly disturbed by the prospect. They ended up not selecting the cheaper fare. Such a last-minute booking meant that the times for the connecting flights were extremely far apart for the lower-cost deals. The cheapest of those was just over $700, but the travel time was over 14 hours. They selected a $1,200 flight with only a 2-hour layover in Atlanta. The total travel time was just over 7 hours. That was the shortest trip they could find. Sue selected the flight and confirmed the purchase with the credit card info. It went through without a hitch. The flight was to leave in 4 hours. She asked Rob if she could drive him to the airport. He insisted on taking a cab, but she was insistent too. He agreed. She could go into work a little late, and they could get by at the diner for a week without him. It was his night off anyway, and they had the next 2 nights to get his shifts covered. She told him she would make sure that he got no shit about it when he got back. He went to pack while she made them something to eat. She made omelets with bacon and avocado. She wanted something hearty for him to travel on, and she wanted to have a nice meal with him before he would be gone for a while. She asked if he still ate normally in between feedings. He laughed at the absurd necessity of the question and told her yes. He threw a small amount of clothes into the suitcase and put all his cash in his pocket. He had become an expert at packing quickly. He was done in no time at all. He was dreading going back to Florida, and he did not want his mood to be caught by Sue. She was already dealing with enough from him. She was being amazing about it all, though. She was really trying. He had no idea if she would be able to accept it and let it ride after she had some more time to process. He had already decided on moving out when he got back. He was putting her through too much. He was surprised at his own conclusions that he had come to. He had accepted what he was and what he had to do. It wasn't easy, but it was doable. He would let himself live, and he would do all that he could with his new life, even if he had to take one a week to maintain it. It was easy because he had no choice. Sue did. She could turn him in. If she didn't, then maybe she was tainting her soul and helping keep his secret. She would find another roommate. He would stay to help her pay rent until he or she had found one for her. He would be unflappable about not staying for much longer. She would be better off. They both would. He would have to get a new job, too. That was easily replaced. He would have to move somewhere that Sue and the cops knew nothing about. He would not live on the road like the dead He stopped himself. He didn't even want profanity in his thoughts. That was where it began before it traveled out of the mouth. He would pay his dues. The fates were, and had been, on his side. That must mean that he was meant for something. He was meant to go on. He would be fine, but he needed to start anew. He wondered if having real friends, let alone a girlfriend, was even a possibility in his new future. He could keep his secret and just find some people and say that he had been surgically altered to help him look the way he really wanted to. He could say he had his teeth filed down by a dentist because he was so dark and mysterious. He would only be able to hang with freaky people who could understand something like that. He could never get too close. He wouldn't put them in danger, and he wouldn't risk letting anyone else know his terrible secret. Maybe it wasn't so terrible. Maybe it was like natural selection in a way. The world was horribly overpopulated. The last time he heard, the global number of people was around 7 billion. It was supposedly only 6 billion back when he was in school. Maybe Mother Nature was sending him out to do her bidding. Maybe that was why he had been more than just lucky. He went to Michelle's desk to write a note. He was sick of writing notes. He had apologized for taking Sue's car. She'd had a right to know. His second note had been much more important. He had warned the state, maybe even the country, maybe the world, about how to save lives. He had not mentioned that part to Sue, and she had found out on her own from the news. He hoped enough other people did too, in order to help spread the word. He wrote a quick goodbye note to Sue. He figured he would be back in a week, but he would leave it on his pillow, just in case. Something in his gut told him to, and he would obey. He mentioned how much he loved her, and how much he hoped she could understand what he had done. He told her about the life insurance policy through work. He had lied to Mike the Dick about having gotten another policy at his previous job, but it seemed appropriate to acquire one due to the circumstances surrounding his very uncertain life. Even though he filled out the paperwork, Things like that had a way of not coming up unless they were asked about. He wanted to put her in a position to ask. She had it coming if anything did happen to him. He couldn't imagine what that could be. He was damn near invulnerable. He could be caught, but he felt he might soon be too strong for any prison to hold. He would use his power for good as much as he could. When he returned, he planned on just ripping up the note. There was probably no reason for her to come into the room while he was gone. The note would be there, though, just in case. He joined her at the table. The food was delicious. Their conversation was almost as light and fluffy as the eggs. It was refreshing and a welcome change for them to relax around each other. There was some inevitable gloom for both of them in the future, as far as their relationship was concerned, and they both knew it, but that could wait. They enjoyed each other's company like it was old times. A few hours later they were in the car, and Sue was driving him to LAX. On the ride there they continued to keep their light mood. They listened to the radio and sang along as loudly and badly as they could. They laughed whenever they couldn't remember the words to whatever song was playing. They were at the airport all too soon. Sue pulled into the loading passengers lane. "Well, we're here," she said to him in the idling car. "Yeah." He had no idea what to say. He felt so much inside of him, but none of it had yet formed into words. There was always the note, just in case. "You call me when you get there." "I will." "Do you think a plane crash would even put a dent in you?" She chuckled. "It might. I hope not to find out," he said. They looked at each other in silence for a minute, and then hugged each other tightly and held on for dear life. Just as Rob was wondering if she would be all right, a parking attendant came by and hit the roof of the car twice, making them both jump. "Get this car moving!" the attendant shouted at them. "Fuck off!" Sue shouted back without hesitation. Rob realized she would be just fine. "Give Rosemary a kiss for me," he said to her. "I will. I'll give that little shit a swat for you, too." He laughed and said goodbye, and got out of the car before he would start to cry. He felt silly. He would be back in a week. She shouted after him, "Love you!" "Love you, too," he shouted over his shoulder as he entered the airport. Rob had been nervous that he would have to walk through an X-ray machine that would reveal that he was a mutant. The only thing he'd had to pass through was a metal detector, and it didn't even beep since he had taken out his wallet and keys. He passed right through security and into the gate's waiting area for his flight. They would let a monster get on the plane. He smiled at himself and thought that he probably felt more like a monster than he actually looked like one. No one was looking at him. He still had on his sunglasses. Maybe he didn't look too strange, or maybe they were deliberately avoiding looking at him because he did. Maybe they thought he was deformed or had been in an accident. He looked down at his hands. The nails had been totally covered and disappeared somewhere under the cuticles. His large hands looked like they had been through a cleansing fire that had burned them smooth. About an hour later his flight announced over the intercom that it was ready for boarding. He got on and put the suitcase in the overhead storage compartment. He had a window seat. The plane was completely booked, and there were 2 other passengers between him and the aisle. The heavy-set man next to him was unintentionally poking him with his elbow. Rob thought about flashing his new teeth at the man, but decided against it. He would behave himself. He squirmed slightly to avoid being jabbed. Soon the plane began to take off, and he watched the world get smaller as it revealed itself to him. The sun was setting, and the populated areas were covered in twinkling lights. Not so far away from the lights were vast, dark sections. He had transformed himself in one of those dark patches. He accepted the offered headphones from the flight attendant and put them on. He covered his mouth with his hand when he spoke. He plugged the headphones into the jack in the arm, but he did not push the button to turn the radio on. It was just a good way to ensure his neighbor passengers would not interact with him. He was preoccupied by too many of his own thoughts. He was far from bored. He already missed Sue. His mother was not going to be fun to be around at all. He was not sure of how much comfort he could be to her. He was going to tell her his idea about having been to a dentist to have his teeth done, and tell her not to start with him or judge. Maybe she would think it was cool. She always tried to be the supportive hipster mom since he had moved out. She didn't care what he did, as long as it didn't affect her. He replayed the killings in his head. The thug, the guy at the construction site, and the fat lady in the lake in Echo Park. Surely they had fished her out by that time. He didn't focus so much on the deeds as the results. They had all been people who had no good intentions on being out at that hour. The guy in Santa Monica had been cruising for sex and was probably spreading disease. The fat bitch in the lake was just crazy. She had started screaming at him, completely unprovoked, about what an asshole he was, and that she could be a bigger asshole than him. He had laughed and said she was a bigger everything than him. She became enraged and attacked him. She had no business continuing to be loose on society at large. Emphasis on the large. He tried to smile at the thought, but couldn't. He had no delusions that what he was doing wasn't bad, too, but it was bad with a function. It was eliminating other bad. Before he knew it, his flight had arrived in Atlanta and was setting down. He killed the couple of hours until his next plane by strolling around the almost deserted airport. There were only a few other people waiting for the flight. It was midnight there, and all the shops were closed. He was finally beginning to get bored when the intercom announced that the flight to Sunnyvale, Florida, was boarding. He was relieved. He was already starting to feel weary from traveling. He wondered why, since all he was doing was mostly sitting in seats. Granted, they were uncomfortable seats. He arrived in Sunnyvale just after 3 a.m. Eastern Time. He was struck by a peculiar sound as soon as he got into the airport there. It was echoing off the walls. It was getting louder and closer. It was a slapping sound. A group of people came around the corner. They were all together, chattering amongst themselves. They were all wearing flip-flops. They were smacking against all those people's heels. That was what the strange sound was. California had a beach community too, but it did not compare to Florida's. He felt slight indigestion and wondered if it was from the nostalgia. He went straight to the exit, since he hadn't checked any bags, and hailed a cab. There were only 2 out front. He forgot what it was like to be in a small town. He hadn't missed it. The cab took him to the address that he had mailed so many cards and gift certificates to for Mother's Days and birthdays and other holidays. It was weird that his mother kept asking for him to come home, because he had never before been to that house. His mom had moved in with Stan after Rob had moved out. He was struck by the isolation of the area. The few scattered houses were classy, but there was nothing cozy about them. When the cab stopped at the address, he thought there might be some mistake. He checked the mailbox and realized he was at the correct location. The house was too nice. He knew Stan was well off, or at least he had been. It had all become his mother's. There were 2 floors, and the roof went to a drastic slant upward on one side. It was a very modern-looking house. There was nothing homey about it, but he wouldn't turn it down if it were offered to him. However, he would not share it for any real length of time with his mother. That hadn't worked before, and it never would again, no matter how roomy the house was. He paid the cabbie and tipped him $5 and sent him on his way. He walked up the walkway that led to the front door. There was a Mercedes in the driveway. Above the front door was a giant circular window, and a crystal chandelier was sparkling on the other side of it. The ceiling above it was dark stained wood. His taste or not, the house was impressive. He rang the doorbell and waited for it to be answered. Rob thought he heard whispering from within and wondered if she had company. Soon after, the door glided open a bit and his mother peeked out. He had not seen her in a few years, and only a bit of her face showed between the partially open door and its frame, but she looked so much older than he remembered. "Rob?" she asked warily. "Yeah, Mom, it's me. I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow at the earliest. I took a flight out as soon as I could. Technically it is tomorrow." She looked confused. "It's after midnight?" he added. "Oh, right. She was acting very out of it. He understood that she had been through a terrible ordeal. He asked her, "Well, can I come in?" She looked behind her for a moment and then turned back to him. "Sure." She let the door swing open. She stared down at the floor. He gave her a light hug. She did not hug him back. She just stood there. He didn't take it personally. She wasn't being disrespectful. They had never been that close anyway. She was just in shock. He looked down at the floor. "Jesus, what is that?" he asked her. She slowly turned her head to look at the trail of blood with him. "It happened here?" he asked her in a shock of his own. She sighed. "Yes." "My God, what happened?" She put her hands to her face and began rubbing her cheeks roughly. An idea dawned on him. She had finally gotten tired of Stan's domineering bullshit, and she had lost it and killed him. She dragged him into the other room, and he was behind the closed door. She called Rob to help her dispose of the body. He had never been too crazy about Stan, and his mother knew that. Rob was the perfect person to call. He dropped his suitcase and grabbed her forearms. "You need to tell me what is going on right now." She rolled her head back. Her eyes were half open and her jaw hung slack. He slid his hands to her upper arms and shook her. "Mom, answer me." "Let's go sit down in the living room." She held out her arm and gestured towards where it was. Her hand hung limply on the end of her arm. "Okay."